The debate over the atomic bomb. Why did Japan surrender in 1945? In August 1945, American bombers dropped the first ever atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. Soon after, the Japanese emperor expressed his intention to surrender. Ever since, a fierce debate has raged among historians. Why did the US really drop the bombs? And what truly compelled Japan to surrender? Few events of the Second World War have sparked as much historical debate as those of August 1945. Historians have long argued whether the atomic bombs were necessary and which factors were most important in causing Japan to surrender. The conventional view, supported by Orthodox historians, mostly follows the mainstream post-war American perspective, that the bombs were the decisive factor in the Japanese surrender. But other historians have argued a different view, that the intervention of the Soviet Union in the Pacific War on August 9, 1945, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, actually triggered the Japanese surrender and arguably made the bombs unnecessary. This view is often called revisionist since it revises or changes the older Orthodox argument. Evolving arguments are a normal part of historians' work in trying to explain the past, and there are differences within the Orthodox and revisionist schools of thought on the bomb. These labels are a bit simplified to help us get to the core of the issue. First, let's take a step back and establish the facts. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied and Soviet forces. In July, the victors met at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin. Near the top of the agenda was the ongoing war against Japan, in which the USSR was still neutral. At Potsdam, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin confirmed his 1943 promise to the Brits and Americans that he would join the war against Japan in exchange for Soviet influence in Manchuria, plus South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. He also revealed the Japanese had approached Moscow with informal peace feelers since 1943. By 1945, it was clear they wanted to use the neutral USSR as a mediator to end the war on better terms. Now remember, testing vague peace ideas with a potential mediator country is not the same as being willing to surrender. All the while, Japan's military was preparing the home islands for defense and blocked any serious peace efforts by politicians. Even Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who favored peace, did not want it at any price. Meanwhile, at Potsdam, U.S. President Harry Truman received a short telegram from the U.S. on July 16, operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet completed, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. This message meant that the first atomic weapons test in New Mexico had been a success. On July 24, Truman casually informed Stalin of a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, equally casually, suggested good use of the bomb could be made against Japan. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Proclamation, but the USSR didn't sign. They called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government was divided on how to respond. Emperor Hirohito was head of state, but the country was actually governed by the so-called Big Six cabinet ministers. 3 ministers wanted to ask the Allies for clarification, while the other 3, all military, wanted to reject the proclamation. In the end, the cabinet simply ignored it, but they could not ignore what happened next. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. It exploded 600 meters above the city, causing ground temperatures to reach 4,000 degrees Celsius. Nearly everyone within 1 kilometer was killed instantly, and those within a 3.5 kilometers radius were terribly burned. High school student Yamaoka Michiko recalled the moment of the explosion. There was no sound. I felt something strong. It was terribly intense. I felt colors. It wasn't heat. You can't really say it was yellow, and it wasn't blue. I thought I would be the only one to die. I said to myself, goodbye, Mom. The bomb destroyed 70,000 of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings and killed up to 110,000 people. The White House released a statement. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26 was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. So the bomb had been dropped and Hiroshima destroyed. At the same time, Japan's leaders were discussing surrender. The initial Japanese response to the American threat to drop more bombs was to delay. Military ministers blocked a planned cabinet meeting, But Japanese diplomats quickly met with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. When the Japanese ambassador met Molotov on August 8 to discuss peace, the Soviet diplomat instead handed him a declaration of war. The next day, 1.5 million Soviet troops invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing Japan's Kwantung Army. The Japanese cabinet finally met but couldn't agree on what to do. Civilian ministers wanted to surrender on the condition the emperor could remain, while most military ministers demanded no occupation, voluntary disarmament of Japanese forces, and Japanese-controlled war crime trials. While they discussed, the second atomic bomb hit Nagasaki, killing 40,000. The emperor himself now intervened with an unprecedented, sacred decision to surrender with one condition: his own retention as monarch. The Japanese sent these terms to the Americans on August 10th, and the U.S. didn't refuse, but didn't accept either. They simply repeated that the Japanese people would choose their own government. On August 15th, after a badly organized military coup by junior officers failed, Hirohito announced that Japan would surrender unconditionally. Fighting in Manchuria stopped on August 16th, and the war formally came to an end on September 2, 1945. So that is the timeline of the end of World War II in Asia. But why did the U.S. decide to drop the bombs? Orthodox historians have argued it was to end the war sooner and save American and Japanese lives by avoiding a bloody invasion of Japan. Since 1943, the U.S. military had been drawing up plans for a possible invasion of Japan. They expected the Japanese would resist with fanaticism. The invasion plan, called Operation Downfall, was to happen in two phases. Allied troops would land at Kyushu on November 1, 1945, then capture the Tokyo Plain in March 1946. The Japanese Ketsugo defense plan was not to defeat the invasion, but to inflict enough losses on the Americans so Japan could get better peace terms. The Americans knew the Japanese were preparing and expected to face 4.5 million Japanese troops in Japan, with 625,000 in Kyushu alone. This was about a 1-to-1 ratio between attackers and defenders, far too close for an offensive. The casualty estimates were probably much exaggerated. Planners had no reliable methodology to use, and U.S. intelligence didn't recognize the poor quality of Japanese units. Modern estimates of possible U.S. casualties run as low as 20,000. Regardless, Orthodox historians maintain it was the expectation of casualties that mattered. The atomic bombs, proven successful in July, provided Truman with an alternative. Revisionist historians, on the other hand, claim Soviet intervention became Truman's worst-case scenario. For revisionists, the atomic bombings had more to do with containing the Soviet Union than defeating Japan. The dropping of the atomic bombs was not so much the last military act of the Second World War as the first major operation of the Cold War with Russia. They argue that although Truman wanted Soviet assistance before Potsdam, he changed his mind. Revisionists believe British Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw a chance to limit Soviet influence and prevent the USSR from getting the Japanese islands and influence in northern China they had been promised. Some in the U.S. government worried that the Soviets couldn't be trusted to respect an agreement, especially on the question of free elections in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, any deal involving China still needed to be run past Chiang Kai-shek. Truman himself wrote his opinion in his memoirs: "I was not willing to trust the Russians." But when the U.S. dropped the Hiroshima bomb, revisionists argue that instead of intimidating the Soviets, it actually spurred them on. Stalin knew about the bomb program thanks to his spies, but the test was a surprise. Apparently outraged, he brought forward the invasion date to August 9. So the orthodox argument that the bombs were dropped to save lives has been questioned by revisionists who argued it was primarily to prevent Soviet gains in Asia. A minority of revisionists have even argued that Soviet mediation might end the war on better terms. According to this line of thought, Japanese leaders now accepted their country could be bombed into submission, especially if the U.S. was going to drop more atomic bombs after the first two. Maybe they would even drop one on Tokyo. In reality, Truman planned to scale back bombings after Nagasaki, and Tokyo was never an atomic target, but the Japanese didn't know this. Their fears, Orthodox historians claim, were increased by the shock of the atomic bombings. Weighing the impact of the Soviet attack, Orthodox historians also say the Soviet attack was not all that important in Japan's decision to capitulate. Japanese leaders knew a Soviet offensive was possible, so its shock impact was minimal. One piece of evidence on this point is a statement